So thank you. I'm focused on whether we should be evolving species, whether we should be evolving bacteria, plants, animals, and humans. And occasionally I get asked a question about ethics. And so I thought, all right, you should probably write a book about ethics because you can't answer it in a question. And ethics is normally seen as that giant manual you get when you go take a new job. And this is the ethics manual, this is the HR manual. Do this, don't do this. And so ethics is often taught as this is right and this is wrong, and do this and don't do that. If you don't know that when you go work somewhere, you probably shouldn't take that job, because that ethics book has been written by Captain Obvious. And it gives us a false sense of security that we know what's right and what's wrong. And that's not really where ethics gets interesting. See, the way ethics is often taught is through cartoons. So how do you tell the bad guys? Well, it's very simple. There's black hats and there's white hats. And so you go and you see the movies, and the good guy's wearing a white hat, and guess what the bad guy wears? Right? And that's often the way that ethics is seen. So let's talk about medicine. Let's take the traditional black hats, the pharmaceutical companies. So as you think about pharmaceutical companies, you think the regulators, especially things like the FDA or the European regulatory authorities, are the people who are the white hats, and they're there to protect you. And they're on the side of right. And these evil pharmaceutical companies are the black hats. And were it that simple? See, the regulator's mission is to protect you. Pharma's mission, as we heard this morning, is to make a profit. So that must be evil, right? And as you're thinking about this stuff, the reason why regulators exist is because there used to be things like cocaine and methamphetamines and a whole series of other things inside patent medicines. And some of these medicines used to be really dangerous. Some of them had mercury in them. So there is a good and decent reason and a smart reason why we should have regulation in pharmaceuticals and across business. I'm not arguing with that. The question that I have is what happens as these regulators get more stringent and more careful? And as you're thinking about this stuff, the black hats get sued so often that a lot of them have just hung up their hats in pharmaceuticals. They've quit innovating. And the primary focus has shifted from being run by chemists who are doing discovery and researchers who are finding new molecules into lawyers and consultants and people who are doing mergers and marketing. And just to give you an order of magnitude on the shift that's happened, pharma is now spending about 2 times as much on sales and marketing as it is on research and development. So all these pharmaceutical ads you see, especially in places like the United States, where the budget for Nexium, for instance, is bigger than the entire budget of Budweiser, is a shift, because it's much easier to sell what you have than to discover something new that might be dangerous or controversial. And as you're thinking about this, you have to ask yourself a question. What if 99% of the people working in a company, even though they are working for profit, would like to make a profit and would like to save lives in the pharmaceutical industry? And in that case, is it possible that the hats look a little more like this than black and white? Right? Because it's very easy to demonize people and say, oh, you just want to make a profit. But people have mixed motives. And some people want to get up in the morning and save people's lives and make a decent wage. And that's not often the way that we discuss this stuff, because it requires nuance. So what happens to a system when it gets overregulated? When people start focusing on not just producing stuff, inventing stuff, researching stuff, but on selling stuff? Well, basically the cost per molecule, per medicine that is going to save you or your kids from cancer or something else, increases across time. So what is this complicated graph? It's the number of medicines you get per $1 billion spent. That is not a good trend line. And so as you're looking at this stuff, over the last 60 years, the new medicines created per billion invested has dropped by a factor of 100. This is like running Moore's Law in reverse, right? This is not good. Because while most of the economy is getting faster, better, cheaper, education is not working that way, and healthcare is not working that way. So the things that cost you and cost your society more are education and healthcare, which are two of the absolutely fundamental issues in rights. And as you're thinking about the structure, it's a little bit like when you jump on a horse, right? If you set a barrier like this, almost every horse makes it over, and that's when drugs cost $100 million to develop in '75, and then you make it a little bit higher, and these cost $300 million, and now there are drugs which cost over $1 billion. When you increase the hurdle rate to produce something, there are less and less horses that jump that hurdle rate. So if you set the regulatory standards in such a way that it is this expensive to get a drug, you are never going to get drugs for things like malaria or for things like Zika, unless if they're made by nonprofit corporations or by foundations from people who made a lot of money. And so less and less drugs come to market, less and less personalized drugs come to market, and the ones that come to market are more and more expensive. So, is it possible that even within the regulatory agencies, some people might even be wearing hats that aren't completely white? And what does that look like? Well, let me talk to you about traffic jams. It used to be that traffic around Washington, D.C. on what they call the Beltway used to actually move. Now it's just a parking lot. And it looks like this. And when it was moving, there was one particular time of day when traffic would just slow down. And it was driving the traffic authorities crazy because they couldn't figure out, why in the world does traffic slow down here every single day? And they looked at this and they looked at that, and finally they write an article about it in the Washington Post, and in comes a letter to the editor. My name is John Nestor. I go to work every morning at 8:27, and I go into the far left-hand lane and drive 49 miles an hour. And the reason I do it is because the law says 50 miles an hour is a speed limit. I have the right to be in the far left-hand lane at 49 miles an hour because I'm following the letter of the law. And that angered people so much that they actually created a verb called nestoring. Well, this law-abiding citizen, guess where he worked? He worked regulating pharmaceuticals at the FDA. And so what did he do? He had an absolutely impeccable record of protecting the public from harmful drugs. And how did he do that? Well, he never approved a single drug in his entire decades-long career at the FDA. Because the letter of the law says what you approve has to be safe. It didn't say you should measure the relative risk of approving and not approving, and he followed the letter of the law, and they tried to fire him, and he got reinstated by Ralph Nader, who sued to reinstate him. And he ended his career without approving a single drug and died, and his obituary was, here was a man known for his strict driving habits who happened to have died of renal failure. Which is ironic because one of the areas where he was in charge of approving new medicines was the renal area, and he might have approved a medicine that might have saved his life. So as you're thinking about relative risk, what happens to regulatory authorities? Well, here's the FDA commissioner. In all the FDA's history, I'm unable to find a single instance where a congressional committee investigated the failure of the FDA to approve a new drug. Because they're white hats. But the times when the hearings were held to criticize our approval of new drugs has been so frequent that we haven't been able to count them. And the message to the FDA staff couldn't be clearer. Is this relevant to Europe? Well, there's a neat thing here called the precautionary principle. I will approve any new technology as long as you show me it doesn't hurt a human being. Well, motherhood and apple pie. What a neat idea. Until you begin to unpack that little baby, and you ask yourself the question. You are allowed to do anything as long as it never hurts a human being. Would you be allowed to build that staircase right there? Would you be allowed to have an electric plug? Would you be allowed to have steel? Would you be allowed to have salt on the table? And in ethics, what we lose is this concept of relative risk, because we tend to go to the extremes. We tend to say, I know what the right answer is, I know what's right, I know what's wrong. And maybe at some point, by not acting, by being too careful, by making it too expensive, we may be killing more people through regulations than we're saving. If a drug takes 12 years to come to market instead of 6, there's a whole series of people who can die during those 6 years. And we measure the harmful effects of drugs. We don't often measure how long it takes, what the incentives are, and how structured it is, and we don't question that because we know who the good people are and who the bad people are. And that's where ethics gets interesting. So, this is a word you don't often hear these days in ethics. I don't know. I don't know the right answer. I'm willing to listen, I'm willing to debate, and as we get closer and closer to evolving things, including ourselves, we really have to do this with less of a black-white and more of a let's talk about it. Because there are people on most sides, not at the extremes of this bell curve, cut the extremes out, but too much of politics, too much of business, and too much of the debate is by this extreme or this extreme, and they force you to the extremes. And that's not where you find the answers. Let me give you current debates that are important. We've been redesigning sex, and we don't even have a clue that we've been redesigning sex because we take it for granted. So, let's have a talk with Grandpa and Grandma about the birds and the bees. That would be uncomfortable, okay? So I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take dear old Grandpa and Grandma, we're going to put them in a time machine, and we're going to bring them back as hot 21-year-olds. So now you've got your 4 grandparents sitting in front of you, and you're going to have a talk about sex and what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing, and how sex works today. Well, here's the first thing you're going to tell them. Oh, by the way, you can have sex today and not have a baby. Do you understand how weird that would be to your grandparents? Because for all of human history, for all of evolutionary history, normally the act had a consequence. And you have completely separated the act from the consequence, and you don't even think about it. But for your grandparents, that would be completely unethical, and weird, and strange, and bizarre. And then you'd say, because I'm going through cancer treatments, I'm going to do IVF. Oh, really? And tell me what IVF is. Well, Grandpa, Grandma, you just take a sperm, you take an egg, you mix them in a plastic dish, and you conceive a child. And they're going to scratch their heads, and they're going to say, hang on for 1 second. So Grandpa and Grandma never come together? Huh. We used to call that the Immaculate Conception. And by the way, we thought that was kind of a miracle. And you're now telling me that you're performing miracles on a constant basis. Well, that's a little weird. And then it turns out that you can freeze those fertilized eggs, and you can have a surrogate mother, which means you can have identical twins born 50 years apart. So you've now decoupled sex from the act, decoupled sex from contact, and decoupled sex from time, and we just take that for granted. And we think, well, of course you can. But for your grandparents, let's have an ethical debate. Dear Grandpa, Grandma, do you think we should do this? It is possible they might have said, no, that's against God's will. Are you out of your mind? So in that context, let's try the same thought experiment. Your great-grandkids are now going to bring you back. You are now age 21, your great-grandkids are age 70. Do you think sex is going to look anything near the same? Do you think the way we're going to be reproducing, how we're going to be changing the genome in 60 years, 70 years, 80 years is going to look anywhere near what we look like today? And how do we judge that? Do we say, I've got the right answer, and I'm going to tell you what technologies I'm going to allow and which ones I'm not? Am I going to judge, by my standards, what 2 or 3 generations from now should be doing? How do we have these debates? You have them with a little bit of humility. You have them saying, I know technology changes ethics. It's a complicated debate, and I may not have all the answers. Because we're going to keep changing things. Thank you very much.